Anyway, today I'm wrapping up a series on Daniel. I know there's 4 chapters left, but these are tough chapters. And I think sometimes with these tough chapters, it's best to just kind of take a bird's eye view and then let you figure the rest out on your own. So our theme for 2021 is redeeming the time. And we've been learning lessons from the book of Daniel in a series which I'm calling Time and Providence. Time, because this book is not just about Daniel, and it's not just about what God did in Daniel's lifetime. But think about it. What God did through Daniel, Daniel never saw the fulfillment of much of it in his lifetime. But Daniel came to realize that he was a small piece in God's much bigger plan. In the book of Daniel, God reveals what's going to happen for the next 500 years and even to the end of the age. Providence. Because God who created the world also sustains the world. Sometimes it doesn't look like God is sustaining the world. It gets pretty messed up, right? But that too is part of God's eternal plan. God will let evil do what evil wants to do for a time so that people recognize evil as evil and turn to God. Today we're going to wrap up the series covering the last 4 chapters. Now I know that's a lot to cover, but by the time you leave here today, you're going to have a timeline for end time events, and you're going to know what's going to happen and in what order. You're going to hear about current events, where they fit on the timeline, and what comes next. And if you want to know more, you can buy my books, subscribe to my magazine, listen to all of my podcasts, and of course, give your regular donations to this ministry. You're laughing. You know I'm kidding, right? I'm kidding, of course. But a lot of money is being made off of this subject. Truth is, I don't know how it's all going to play out. And I think anybody who thinks that they do is fooling themselves. Now, it's true, the Bible does give us clues. But the theories as to what those clues mean are constantly changing. And each time a popular Bible teacher changes their mind, guess what? They get to sell another book. Telling you why they were wrong before, but now they're right. You know, there's a lot that I don't understand about end times. But I think it's good for us to focus on what we do understand. It's easy to believe God when times are good, but how do we find faith in difficult times? Well, we learn from what has happened before, and we recognize the patterns as they happen again. And then we put all of that into the perspective of a greater spiritual battle which has been going on from the beginning, but which will be won in the end. And more than that, we know God and His eternal purpose. Time and providence will purify us until we shine. So first, I call this understanding end times, but first let's understand the times. Beginning in Daniel chapter 9, first 5 verses. In the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus, by descendant of Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Then I turned my face to the Lord God, seeking him by prayer and pleas for mercy, with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession, saying, O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. We have sinned and done wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and your rules. So if you're following along in your bulletin insert, or for those of you watching online, there's the digital bulletin that you can pull up on your smartphone. Here's the first fill in the blank. Know when to fast and pray. Know when to fast and pray. So Jeremiah prophesied that the Babylonian exile would last for 70 years. And here's that scripture right here. Jeremiah 25, 11 to 12. The whole land shall become a ruin and a waste. These nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste. So if that prophecy coincided with the first wave of exiles, the same one that took Daniel into Babylon as a teenager, we are now about 68 years later. And Daniel is an old man in his mid to late 80s. Daniel has been counting down the years. And he knows that this prophecy is about to be fulfilled. But keep in mind, not only are the exiles going to return to Israel, but Babylon is going to be punished. Daniel is in Babylon, and he's probably not up to taking a very long trip. But then there's the question, is Israel even ready to return? Have they learned their lesson? Will things be any different than they were before the exile? Daniel devotes himself to fasting and prayer. Now, we all know about prayer, but why fasting? Well, because fasting helps us to tune in spiritually to what God is saying. You've heard me say it before, I'll say it again. We're all divided. We are flesh and we are spirit, right? If you want to increase the spirit, you deny the flesh. Now, there's nothing wrong with eating food and enjoying life. But pleasure has its own kind of high that also dulls the spiritual senses. I try to make a regular practice of fasting to seek the Lord for spiritual direction. Throughout the years, whenever I've had to make a major life decision, I take some time in prayer and fasting, seeking the Lord for direction, seeking the Lord for His blessing, seeking the Lord for clarity. Each year, I take a spiritual retreat to seek the Lord for direction. And before I take that time to seek the Lord, I spend some time in prayer and fasting because I want to be able to hear the Lord clearly. We do this as a congregation. We begin each year with a time of fasting and prayer, seeking the Lord's blessing and guidance for that year. Now this year, I decided to do something different. I've been fasting one day a week. And I do it on my sermon prep day. I fast that day, usually a Wednesday. And it actually helps me because fasting is not so much focusing on not doing things. Just try it sometime. Focus on not doing something and see how well that goes, right? But rather, it's focusing on something. So for me to focus that day on my sermon preparation and on hearing God, you know what? I don't even miss it. I forget to eat because I'm focused on the Lord. On longer fasts, I found that after a few days, I'm not hungry anymore. But I have more time and attention to devote to prayer. But the real benefit of fasting is hearing God better, more clearly, and understanding what we hear. So this is the next fill in the blank. Recognize and acknowledge the truth. Let's pick up with Daniel again in verse 9. To the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, for we have rebelled against him. and have not obeyed the voice of the Lord our God by walking in his laws, which he set before us by his servants the prophets. All Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, refusing to obey your voice. And the curse and the oath that are written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out upon us because we have sinned against him. He has confirmed his words which he spoke against us and against our rulers who ruled us, by bringing upon us a great calamity. For under the whole heaven there has not been done anything like what has been done against Jerusalem. As it is written in the law of Moses, all this calamity has come upon us, yet we have not entreated the favor of the Lord our God, turning from our iniquities and gaining insight by your truth. Therefore the Lord has kept ready the calamity that he has brought upon us. For the Lord our God is righteous in all the works that he does, and we have not obeyed his voice. And now, O Lord our God, who brought your people out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand, and have made a name for yourself as at this day, we have sinned, we have done wickedly. O Lord, according to all your righteous acts, let your anger and wrath turn away from your city Jerusalem, your holy hill, because for our sins and for the iniquities of our father, Jerusalem and your people have become a byword among all who are around us. You know, Daniel's prayer in chapter 9 has become a model for intercession. Notice what he does. And I have this pattern up on the next slide. First of all, adoration, right? Adoration. He begins with remembering who God is and his attributes, especially his covenant faithfulness. You can do this in your own prayer time. Just begin your prayers with adoration. We usually begin with the last one, right? But let's start with the first one. Let's start with just remembering who God is. God, you're awesome. You're loving. You have been so faithful to me. And then move on to confession. Notice Daniel confesses the sin of Israel corporately. We have sinned. We have forgotten you. We have brought upon ourselves the curse that we agreed to. He's speaking as a representative of his people, many of whom will not or cannot do what he's doing, but he's speaking on their behalf. And then petition. Only after making right relationship can you make your requests. Think about this. I mean, we do this all the time. You don't just go to your neighbor and say, "Can I borrow your lawnmower?" Right? You start out with, "Hey, how are you? How's things going? How's the wife? How's the kids? How's the family? Hey, how you doing?" And then when you get the small talk going and you're feeling good, and it's like, "By the way, can I borrow your lawnmower?" Petition comes after we have established right relationship with God. Remember how Moses and the people, they chose between blessing and cursing. Let me take you back to that scripture. Deuteronomy 11, 26 to 28. Moses said to the people, "See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and the curse if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way I am commanding you today, to go after other gods whom you have not known." And Israel did exactly what God told them not to do. The exile was not about God forsaking his people. It's about God's people forsaking their God. Exile is a natural consequence of disobedience, the result of rebellion. It's the distance that comes from broken relationship. And that's important to remember, because Israel exile is not the only exile in the Bible. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Israel is God's chosen people. But what are they chosen for? They're chosen to be a witness and a testimony to the world. And they rebelled against God. And God had to let them experience the results of their choice so that they would know where that path leads. But so many times we get it backwards when we feel distant from God. We think, God did this to me. When we're suffering, we cry out, how long? Remember that from last week? How long, O God? And we think God doesn't hear. And then after a while, we're tempted to think that God doesn't care. We ask, why doesn't God do anything? But God is doing something. He's honoring our choices and letting us experience the consequences of those choices. When we reap the consequences of our own actions, we think God is punishing us. We think God must be angry. God is angry, but not at us. He's angry at the destructiveness of sin and the deception under which we're bound. He also knows that if he rescues us too soon, we'll probably just go back to the same patterns that got us in trouble in the first place. Sometimes God has to put us in time out. Remember that? Time out. Not time out so that you know you're bad, but time out so that you have time to calm down, to reflect, and hopefully, this is always the purpose of time out, that maybe you'll remember how to be good. God is not new at this. He's been dealing with rebellion since the beginning. And he has a plan to bring it all back together in the end. And that's the next fill in the blank. Be aware of the bigger picture. Be aware of the bigger picture. So let's pick up again in verse 22. He made me understand, speaking with me and saying, O Daniel, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding. Did you know at the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out? And I've come to tell it to you because you are greatly loved. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision. 70 weeks, now that's literally 70 sevens, are decreed about your people and your holy city, to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. So Jeremiah's prophecy said that Israel's time out would last for 70 years. But now Daniel gets a bigger perspective. Israel has indeed learned a lesson, but they are not yet what they should be. The problem of human sin, not just Israel, but human sin, is only getting worse. That's shown by the vision of the successive empires and how they just get worse through time over the next 500 years. What is God going to do about that? There's another exile taking place. The exile of humanity from the presence of God. This one is not just 70 years. 7's important. 7 is the number of completion. God completed creation in a week, 7 days. So 70 should be like the ultimate completion, 10 times 7, right? Surely 70 years are enough to complete this process, this lesson. But what we think is enough is never enough. God says there are going to be 70 times 7, or 7 weeks, until all that needs to happen has happened. Admittedly, this passage right here is probably one of the most difficult passages in the Bible, so I'm attempting a lot to try to explain it. Daniel's 70 weeks are commonly understood to refer to a period of 490 years. Now, some people say that the number is not important, it just means a long time. I'm not one of those people. Some say that Daniel's vision, the 490 years begins with Daniel's vision and it ends with the death of Antiochus IV, who was a really, really bad man. We talked about him last time, you remember? He was the little horn with the big mouth in Daniel's vision and a prototype of the Antichrist. But then the number is also broken down into distinct parts and defined. So 7 sevens, roughly 49 years, is roughly the amount of time it took to restore Jerusalem's fortification and to rebuild the temple. And then 62 sevens, 434 years, takes us up to Jesus. His baptism, his ministry, his death on the cross, kind of depending on how you do the numbers. And that's the real temple. God's presence on earth being built again in Jesus Christ. But that leaves one more 7. And this is where the text goes back to talking about disaster, apocalypse, and end times. And that's why many people believe that the last 7 hasn't happened yet. And that it describes a time which God is saving for the end, just before Christ's return. Some people think that it describes the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Notice another 7. And the persecutions that happened at that time. I don't know. I don't know the answer exactly. But John picks up the theme of 7s again in Revelation. That's why there's 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 plagues, and 7 bowls. John was writing about the persecution that was happening in his day. He saw it as being the fulfillment of Daniel's vision. But many people, including many of us, believe that he was also describing events yet to come. Remember what we said last week, how history repeats itself? It doesn't have to be either. It can be both. Just because you can point to something and say it's already happened doesn't mean it won't happen again. In fact, it often or usually does. Now, I can't tell you how all of this is going to play out. I personally don't think that anything must happen before Jesus returns, because most of it already has happened. Multiple times over, some of it. Much of what has been predicted about the tribulation of the future is already currently happening somewhere to believers in the world today. We need to understand, folks, we are already living in end times and have been for a while. We're not looking for a battle that's yet to come. The battle is already here. Let's talk about understanding the battle. Here's your first fill in the blank in this section. Fear God more than the enemy. Fear God more than the enemy. This is the thing. Whenever we talk about end times, people start to get afraid. And it's like, no. Fear God. Because if you fear God, you don't have to be afraid of anything else. Let's skip to chapter 10, verse 4. On the 24th day of the first month, I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, And I lifted up my eyes, and I looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches. Weren't we just singing that? Weren't we just prophesying that? Look into his eyes. His arms and his legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men who were with me did not see the vision, but a great trembling fell upon them, and they fled to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sound of his words, and I heard the sound of his words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. So who or what did Daniel see? I think he saw a vision of Jesus. Jesus Christ as victorious. Now, why do I believe that? I believe that because it sounds just like other New Testament visions of Jesus that are in the Bible. One of them is in Acts chapter 9. But Saul, later called Paul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters to the synagogues in Damascus. Now, skip a few lines down. Now he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what to do. Now listen to this. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. And Saul rose from the ground. Although his eyes were open, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. Does that sound like a man whose strength is gone? And for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. So that's when Saul became Paul. But the vision that he saw, just like Daniel, the others with him didn't see it, but they felt it. And the vision left him physically incapacitated. This was not a vision of baby Jesus or even the gentle shepherd. This was the conquering king that he saw. So here it is again, Revelation chapter 1, 12 to 17. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands was one like the Son of Man, clothed with a long robe, with a golden sash around his chest. Oh, we've seen that before, right? The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. Doesn't that sound familiar? In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. And listen to this. When I saw him, I fell at his feet, though dead. Just like Daniel. Face plant. But he laid his right hand on me and said, Fear not. Fear not. That's easy for him to say. Not for us. Just like in Daniel's vision, John sees a glowing figure with eyes of fire. And his voice was like many sounds at once. So the descriptions are similar, but not exactly the same. You know, that's actually good. Because if you're an investigator and you hear exactly the same thing word for word, then you think people are copying off of one another. But these descriptions are similar, but not exactly the same, which tells me what? they saw the same thing. You know, the whole idea of end times can be really scary, but here's the point. Get a vision of who Jesus is. Daniel, Paul, John, all of them needed to get a vision of Jesus to get perspective. Who is Jesus compared to all of this? If you fear God, you don't have to be afraid of anyone or anything else. And here's the next fill in the blank. The enemy will resist, but he can only delay. The enemy will resist, but he can only delay. Picking up in verse 12. Then he said to me, "Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. For I was left there with the king of Persia, and came to make you understand what has to happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision is for days yet to come." Now this is probably Gabriel talking here, probably an angel that showed up along with the vision of Jesus. There was a fight to get this revelation. There was a fight for this revelation, and there was a demon called the Prince of Persia that was standing in the way. Now remember the unseen realm? We talked about this. The heavenly beings were given the opportunity to rule, but they became corrupt. So they're in open rebellion and resisting the plan of God. Some of them are still trying to interfere with God's people and God's plan, but they can't stop the plan from unfolding any more than the Grinch can steal Christmas. Remember that one? It came anyway. And God's plan, God's end will come anyway. So what does this have to do with us? Well, let me just put it this way, and this is the next fill in the blank. You can either contend with God or against God. You can't avoid the battle. The question is, which side are you going to fight on? Are you going to fight with God or against God? Picking up in verse 18. "Again, one having the appearance of a man touched me and strengthened me." He can make you feel weak, but he can also strengthen you. "And said, O man greatly loved, fear not, peace be with you, be strong and of good courage. And as he spoke to me, I was strengthened, and said, Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. And he said, Do you know why I have come to you? But now I'm going to return to fight against the prince of Persia, and when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come, and he will tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is none who contends by my side against these, except Michael, your prince." So in Daniel, God's plan is referred to as the book of truth. You ever think about this? God is writing a book. It's the book of truth. God is writing history. You ever thought about it? History is actually his story. It's the story of truth. Truth is truth. Truth is what's really real. You know, there's a whole study in degrees of how do we know what's real is real? God says so. Truth is truth. It's the story that he's writing. You can't change truth. You can only distort it. We call those lies. And lies are only as powerful as the little bit of truth that they contain. Eventually, lies are seen for what they are. Why? Because they fall apart. Truth sorts itself out over time. So where does that leave us? You have to decide which side of this battle you're on. God is God. You're either on his side or you're not. You're either with him or you're against him. You don't get to make your own truth. You don't get to make your own reality any more than you get to make your own God. That's what lies are. You don't get to pick or choose which parts of the Bible you like or don't like. This is war. You are either under orders or you are insubordinate. Are you going to contend by Jesus' side, or are you going to face him in battle? What do you want? There isn't any more middle ground. Certainly not as these end times are unfolding. And here's the last part. Understand God's eternal purpose. So here's the fill in the blank. God is writing history. God is writing history. And now we're in chapter 11, picking up in verse 2. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And he has become strong through his riches. He shall stir up against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided towards the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. Now I read this as kind of like a little sample. The truth is that these next verses, the first 35 verses of chapter 11, are absolutely astonishing. To anyone who has studied history, this revelation to Daniel goes through every kingdom and every ruler to govern the Holy Land, right through Antiochus IV and the Maccabean revolt. It's all there. It's all spelled out, so much so that liberal scholars insist that this could not have been written until after things happened, because it's so detailed. Well, that is the spirit of prophecy. The verses that we just read are about Alexander the Great, who conquered vast amounts of territory, but it was divided among his 4 generals, not his heirs. I don't know if you've heard this before, but Israel sits as a land bridge between Egypt and Syria. And it's all described in these verses, but what has happened is that they're constantly volleying back and forth for control of this prime real estate. Eventually, Rome comes in and dominates. And Israel is plundered to pay tribute to Rome. Antiochus, whom this all kinds of leads to, he establishes an alliance. He's over Syria. He establishes an alliance with Egypt by giving his daughter in marriage. You've heard of her. She's called Cleopatra. But she betrays him. And then he goes and attacks Egypt. And he loses that battle. And he's returning to Syria angry, defeated, embittered. And what does he do? He takes it out on the Jews. He was a very bad man. The first manifestation of Antichrist. But here's the thing that you may not have known. Many of the Jews at the time were actually helping him fight Egypt until he turned on them. And here's another fill in the blank. History sorts people out. Let me pick up again in verse 32. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, for though some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, but many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, made white until the time of the end. For it still awaits an appointed time. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper until the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. So after such a prolonged history of belonging either to Egypt or Syria, that became the question. Whose side are we going to join with? Should we ally with Egypt? Should we ally with Syria? The answer, of course, would be whichever they perceive to be stronger. So when Antiochus' daughter marries the Egyptian prince, it seemed like they finally wouldn't have to take sides. Remember what Jeremiah said? Peace, peace, when there is no peace. But that didn't last. And Antiochus became bitter, and he did what bitter people do. He started to hurt people. And when that doesn't go well, you act like you're God, and that you're entitled to hurt people. But some people knew that they did not belong to Syria, and they did not belong to Egypt, but that they belonged to God. And that's why the scripture says, but those who knew their God, those who knew to whom they really belonged, they were strong, and they took action. Nobody should get away with hurting God's people. Verse 32 again, in the New Living Translation. He will flatter and win over those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will be strong and will resist them. I think this verse is going to happen again. So the question is, who do you belong to? You either belong to God or you're left with take your pick. Right? And here's the next fill in the blank. Each choice has its destiny. Each choice has its destiny. Each choice is a path. And your destiny is wherever that path leads. Now we're in chapter 12, verse 1. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as has never been since there was a nation until that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, and some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Here it is again. But those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words, seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. So verse 36 is a turning point. From verse 36 on to the end of chapter 11 and into chapter 12, the description continues of one who is like Antiochus, except those who study history say this part doesn't fit. The things that are described are not accurate, not to that accurate detail like there was before. So either there's something we don't know, or these verses actually apply to someone else. Just as the last sevens is this mystery that seems to have its reprise at the end, it may be that one like Antiochus, the Antichrist described by Paul and John, is yet to arise. It's possible, but I'm not certain. All I know is this. God had Daniel write out all of these things so that the Jews living in the 2nd century BC would have a record and would know that God called this a long time ago. Christians and Jews living in the 1st century AD, when the temple was destroyed, would again read this record and would know that God revealed all of these things long ago when the kingdoms of this world first began to unravel. Essentially, God told us it's going to get worse before it gets better. It's a spiritual battle. And you need to decide which side you're on, because each choice has a destiny. The people who decide that it's expedient to follow this ruler or that ruler are going to share in the fate of that person whom they've chosen to follow. You can side with the king of the north and die, or you can side with the king of the south and die. Kind of like that movie, The Matrix, right? You can take the red pill or you can take the blue pill. They both end up the same place. Or you can say, I belong to God. Then even if you die, you live. You'll be back for the curtain call at the end of the show. And here's the other thing. We get to shine like the stars. We talked last week about mirroring, how mirroring is so important. You shine like the stars because you are mirroring that glowing figure with the eyes of fire. Forever, forever and ever. Is Pat, oh yeah, you're in the back there. Pat, would you come? Here's our questions for reflection this week. When's the last time you fasted and prayed? Are you hearing God's voice and discerning the times? That's a good thing to do when you fast and pray. God, what are you saying? What does all of this mean? What do you want me to know? And here's another question. Are you praying like Daniel for our nation and for God's people? There was a reason why Daniel went to fasting and prayer, because there was a lot on the line. And even though God's plan is firm, he wants the participation of his people in calling these things forth. Number 2, have you had an encounter with Jesus that transformed you? Is your Jesus mild? Are you worshiping baby Jesus? Or have you looked into those eyes of fire? How does your image of Christ prepare you for battle? Question number 3. What about end times can you be sure of? Are you still trying to figure out whose side God is on? Is God a Republican or a Democrat? Is God a globalist or a freedom fighter? God is God. What's important is that your attention is fixed on him. Are you among the wise who purify themselves and shine? Let's worship the Lord as we respond to these things.